Good morning and welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the current installment of our COVID-19 e-seminar series on the politics of pandemics. Since it's 9 o'clock, I figure that we should get started without further ado. And also because of how busy everyone is these days with all of the things that we're doing in our own ways to try to support and respond to the COVID-19 emergency. So the topic of our e-seminar today is the politics of pandemics. It's a great pleasure to introduce the two speakers that we have lined up. Our first speaker is Filipe Campante from Johns Hopkins SAIS. He's the Bloomberg Distinguished Associate Professor there, and he has worked and published extensively in political economy, development economics, and regional and urban issues. He'll be sharing with us insights from his research on how the Ebola epidemic a couple of years ago affected and influenced politics. Our second speaker is our very own Stuti Khemani, who is a senior economist in the Development Research Group in the World Bank. She is joined in the early 2000s and has been working in DECRG on a variety of topics relating to the political economy of development. And, most notably was the lead author of a recent policy research report on making politics work for development. And then just to not have an interruption in the flow, I'll also just jump ahead and welcome our discussant as well. Our discussant is Antonio Spilimbergo. He's the Deputy Director in the Research Department at the IMF. Antonio has a long and distinguished career both in research and in operations in the fund, and has an incredibly prolific and diverse set of research interests, political economy being one of them. So it's a pleasure to have such a great lineup for today's seminar. I believe we're going to start with Filipe for about 20 minutes, followed by Stuti for about 20 minutes, and then we'll go straight to Antonio for discussion, 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for comments and questions from all of you wherever you're joining us. What I'll do, Filipe and Stuti, is I'll give you both kind of a 5-minute warning, just to help you to stay on top of the time. So without further ado, over to you, Filipe.
Thank you very much, Art. I hope you can all hear me. Let me share my slides. Okay, I think you can all see that, right? So this is a great pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. And this is a project that I had been working on with Emilio de Petris Chauvin and Ruben Durante, and the COVID, the emergence of the COVID crisis, or just made this more urgent, and it's great to kind of be able to contribute to the debate here. So the way I like to think about this is if you think about the political impact of a pandemic, and COVID-19 in particular, which is an enormous example, right? Is a huge shock. First of all, it's so huge that it's kind of hard to think that it won't have political electoral effects in this country, in the U.S. and elsewhere as well. And I think there are 3 different dimensions that we can explore here, 2 of which I think we understand a little bit better. So on the one hand, there's the economic dimension. As we all know, we're right now going through a major economic downturn. There's going to be a tremendous fallout from this, and we understand that economic shocks have electoral impacts. In the U.S. in particular, it's a widely studied topic, but even more broadly. Now, there's a second dimension, which I would call the policy dimension, which is COVID is requiring an enormous policy response, right? And it's natural that incumbents would be judged by their response to the crisis. People will update their views on incumbents based on their response to the crisis. This may actually have one dimension, which is so-called rally around the flag dimension, right? In a moment of crisis, people have a tendency to try and rally around the incumbent, so to speak. That may be a part of this, but there's this big policy component, and this is obviously still unfolding because the policy response is unfolding. But there's a third element, which I would argue is not as well understood as the other two, which is sort of the psychological impact, right? So there's a threat out there, a multifaceted threat, starting with just the virus itself, and that can in itself affect the behavior of voters. And this is what we are going to look at specifically in this research. So if we think about the role of emotions in politics, and in particular the role of fear as a particularly powerful emotion, it's quite it makes a lot of sense. People talk a lot about how these are powerful tools for influencing voting behavior, and politicians, anecdotally, it's quite clear that they use fear to mobilize voters, often against sort of external threats, be it immigrants or terrorism or whatever the case may be. And there is a substantial body of work, mostly kind of coming from lab experiments about the impact that just priming sentiments of fear, of anxiety may have. But sort of real world evidence is a bit more complicated because from an empirical perspective, it's kind of hard to disentangle the impact of fear from other factors, precisely because whenever there's a shock that triggers that in practice, it often requires a policy response. So all of those different elements that I have just alluded to are present as well. So disentangling that is complicated. So what we do in this paper is to look at the impact of the Ebola outbreak in 2014, which, as I'm going to go over, happened right before or reached the U.S. Right before the U.S. midterm elections of that year. And this gives us a very unique context to look at this fear aspect, because the perceived threat was quite high. It had a very stark impact on public discourse. But the actual risk, sort of the effect it had on sort of the public health environment, was quite low. So unlike what we're having now, we can sort of isolate the fear shock from these other dimensions for the most part, which typically complicate the inference. So just to give you some context, you may remember in 2014 there was this very important Ebola outbreak centered in West Africa. So we can see here, this is Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, and it was a very important public health shock in these countries. So we see like thousands of cases. As you all know, it's a disease with very high mortality, no effective treatment. And if we look at sort of how it spread across different places, massive shock in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, not so much elsewhere, right? And in particular, if we look at the United States, there were a total of 4 cases, 1 death among these cases. And just to give you a comparison, if you look at the 2009 influenza, not even to mention what we're going through right now, it's just a completely different order of magnitude, right? So this was not a major public health shock in the U.S. However, it was a major, media episode in the U.S., right? So these are just a couple of screenshots and pictures from back in the day. So there was, a lot of panic surrounding Ebola, as I suppose many of you might remember. If you just look at the numbers here, on the left-hand side, we see the network news, and the right-hand side, the cable news. So there was this, pretty sharp peak of news and discussion about Ebola. And the vertical red line there is election week, right? So the midterm election. So this was happening right before the election, or the month before the election. So, it happened in a moment that sort of maximize the potential electoral impact at that point in time. So what we're going to do is use this to ask a number of questions and try to answer them. So first of all, did that panic influence voters? If it did, in which direction? So in particular, which party benefited from that effect? And then we want to ask how, right? So what were the mechanisms involved? And in particular, were there or was there strategic behavior by politicians kind of using that? If so, how and how effective, right? And obviously, like, we need first to kind of try and figure out sort of the causal impact here. How do we know that Ebola caused all of this? And then how do, for that, we need to figure out, like, how do we measure the extent of the Ebola panic, if you will. And this is what we do here. So for our causal identification, we're going to exploit the timing and the location of Ebola cases in the US. So first case, late September, was one individual, Liberian national, who was visiting the US and was diagnosed with Ebola, and he was in Dallas, Texas. Soon afterwards, one of the nurses so two nurses actually tested positive, nurses who had assisted this patient tested positive, and this nurse in particular, she had traveled to Akron, Ohio, in between being infected and being diagnosed. And finally, there was a doctor who had been working in Guinea, sort of trying to help in the crisis, and was diagnosed once he was back in New York City. So these were the cases. So we have this sort of geographical, arguably sort of, idiosyncratic, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, exposure to the cases across the US. I'm going to try to exploit that and the timing to get at the causal impact of the Ebola concerns. So just to give you a sense of then how we can measure Ebola concerns. So one thing that we do is to look at Google searches for the term Ebola. And as we can see, the prevalence of Google searches is very much kind of correlated with the geographical exposure to these cases, right? So large dark blue areas around Dallas, Cleveland, Akron, and New York City. And so this is kind of indicating that there is this effect of proximity to Ebola cases and the degree of concern with Ebola cases. And we can do that for tweets as well. So tweets with the word Ebola or hashtag Ebola, you see kind of a similar picture here. Now, if we look at the timing, we see that there was this geographic pattern associated with the specific timing as well. So the green here are searches that are in Texas, and we see that they peak once there's the first case in Dallas. Then the first case travels to Cleveland. Then there's a peak in the red line, which is the Ohio searches, and Dallas peaks back as well. And then there's a blue peak here in New York City right after the first case in New York. So as people get exposed, the concern rises, and we can kind of pick that up using those some measures of online activity. Okay, and here is the figure for tweets as well. So same idea. Now, so what we're going to do then is to use the distance to the nearest Ebola case as a predictor of Ebola concerns, right? So as an instrument for Ebola concerns, and we show that conditional on sort of previous electoral outcomes. So it's basically uncorrelated with previous electoral outcomes. It's uncorrelated with Ebola concerns before the cases emerge. So it's not as if these areas somehow would be more prone to worry about Ebola, or these areas or proximity kind of picks up something about like you're more likely to vote Democrat or Republican. We show that this is not the case for previous outcomes. And the first key finding is that greater Ebola concerns led to a lower Democratic vote share in the midterm elections at the House, Senate, and gubernatorial levels, right? So the Democrats were harmed by the the prevalence of Ebola concerns. And just to give you a quantitative idea of the size of the effect, if you take a 1 standard deviation increase in the concerns as measured, both by searches and by tweets, this led to a 4.3 percentage point drop in the Democratic vote share. And, this would have swung 15 House races. So this is for House elections. The numbers are similar for Senate and gubernatorial elections. So this would have swung 15 races that were won by the Republicans, which basically would have wiped out all the gains that the GOP had between 2010 and 2014, which were like, so they increased their majority by 13 seats. So it's a sizable impact that we're talking about here. So that's the first key result. Now, you may wonder, maybe this was associated to an effect where voters were disappointed with the incumbent's reaction, or just kind of some immediate response that the panic kind of gets projected onto the incumbents. And the first thing to note is we see no effect on Republican incumbents. So that's the first thing here. But you may wonder, perhaps it was about Obama being the incumbent that people had in mind, right? And if you think and go back to that time, there was this perception, right? So these are headlines from that month. So is Ebola Obama's Katrina moment? President Obama's Ebola problem, and you even had some celebrities at the time who were kind of criticizing President Obama about the response to the Ebola crisis. So that was a thing back in the day. Well, we actually find, using the daily variation in Gallup ratings that asks about approval or disapproval over the president, and there's basically precisely estimated 0 effect on Obama's approval rating. Okay, so there was no effect on Obama's approval rating, and this, I guess, kind of provides some evidence that there isn't sort of this automatic impact of sort of that fear related to the epidemic projected on the incumbent. And I think that's something that is important to keep in mind for the current context. But then, like, what was driving this effect then? Perhaps politicians were kind of trying to make use of that episode. And this is just one example. We have another, others in the paper. It's just very easy to find. So this is Senator Rand Paul at the time saying, Ebola, this major threat, and crucially kind of making this association with the border and immigration and tying these topics together, right? So the idea that you have this foreign disease that can come and kind of, building this association here, I think is also something that's quite important. And I'm going to get back to this. So there's a perception that this was exploited at the time, and we can see this in the data, right? So this is one example. So members of Congress, they can send newsletters to their constituents, and they do, and we can look at the text of these newsletters. And what we find here is that immediately once you have the first case in the US, there's this big jump in the solid line with mentions of Ebola in newsletters from Republicans. The solid blue line is from Democrats, so you see it's much more by Republicans. And the dashed line here with the axis right on the right are the newsletters that are talking about Ebola and immigration at the same time, right? So it's not just that Republicans are talking about Ebola, they're talking about that in association with specific topics, as illustrated by the Rand Paul quote. And we can look at sort of exploit that timing, and we see that Republicans start sending more newsletters mentioning Ebola after the first case. In particular, Republicans in competitive races start sending more newsletters disproportionately. So that's sort of indicating that there is a strategic motive here, and it's not just about Republicans, being more concerned in general or representing places that are likely to be more concerned. And they are doing that in association with certain topics, in particular immigration and Obama, right? So that's important because they're talking about immigration, they're talking about Obama, and we've already seen that the Obama angle, maybe didn't work quite so much. Okay. Now we can look at campaign ads, and for ads, we can we don't have, or we haven't yet explored the text of the ads, but we do have a measure of the fear content of ads, which is using the use of ominous music and other sort of fear cues. And what we see here is, again, that, well, both parties are kind of exploiting fear, and kind of increases after the the first Ebola case, but the association with fear and immigration, again, is something that the Republicans are doing and the Democrats like not quite as much, right? So there's this kind of strategic association, and we look at the data more systematically, and we see the same thing. So Republicans start broadcasting more ads disproportionately, again, more so in competitive races, responding to the proximity. So Republicans in places kind of closer will do that more as well, and again, in association with immigration, in association with Obama as well. Okay. Now,
Filipe, I'll just
yes.
jump in and give you your 5-minute warning.
Okay. Thanks so much. I think I'm good. So then the question is, did it work? And you know, here it's a little bit complicated to pinpoint the specific effect of the strategy, but we can see sort of the change in voters' reported attitudes. And I think it's particularly interesting because sort of the lab evidence about the effect of like priming fear and anxiety is that it tends to make people kind of more conservative. So one question is like, did Ebola make voters just kind of more conservative across the board? And what we see here is if we look at the congressional election survey, we see across a number of different topics kind of related to sort of conservative issues in the US and sort of just conservative leanings in general, we see no effect. So no effect of like general break towards conservatism, but we did see an effect about immigration. So not about Obama again, because you know, consistent with the Gallup data, nothing on the Obama front. Nothing much on, you know, whether you're pro-gun or anti-gay marriage or whether you identify as conservative, but there is this increase in anti-immigrant sentiment. So the closest you are to an Obama case, to an Ebola case, I'm sorry, you know, that is associated with voters becoming more anti-immigration, right? So just to summarize, we find a significant effect of fear on voting and favoring Republicans over Democrats, sort of in an important magnitude. But this was not driven by general disappointment with incumbent or sort of an association with the incumbent, even though that was, so Republicans tried to create that association, right? But it doesn't seem to have worked, right? And it doesn't seem to have been driven by voters just becoming generally more conservative. Instead, there is evidence of that strategic behavior kind of trying to tie Ebola to other issues. And it seems that the issue of immigration was the one that seemed to stick, right? So this is kind of the basic message that comes out of the paper. So then I guess the immediate and pressing question is, what does it mean now if we think about the COVID shock? And the first thing to note here is that there are very important differences, because you know, if you go back to the distinction that I was trying to raise between the economic, the policy, and sort of the psychological dimensions, obviously the economic and policy shocks are much bigger now, because now like you do have the kind of disruption that we're witnessing, which is pretty unprecedented in sort of our lifetimes. So it's just going to be much bigger on that front. But by the same token, the fear factor should be much bigger now as well, right? Because the actual change in the public health environment and the threat that this actually represents is a lot bigger now than it was in the case of Ebola. So you might say, like, you know, this could also be considerably larger now. And here I think there are some important similarities, right? Because it's also like a foreign disease, quote unquote, like something that is coming from the outside, right? So in that sense, it is very much kind of comparable to the type of threat that Ebola kind of represented back in the day. And you can clearly see, I think, right now that there is, you know, you can see some attempts of kind of trying to use a similar playbook, right? So kind of trying to build an association with, you know, foreigners, you know, the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, or whatever that you can see politicians kind of trying to do, and sort of this playing it against China or against, you know, foreign institutions, now, you know, the WHO or what have you. So this strategy, I think, of building these associations seems to be it seems like it's being tried again. And the evidence that we find from Ebola is that it seems to have worked. It seems to have resonated with voters back then. So we might anticipate that there's a chance that this could play out as well along this dimension. Now, the key question that then I think we need to think about is, are there other associations that are possible here? And if you think about like the way politicians are going to respond to that, and I think Republicans are kind of going in this direction, which seems to have worked back then. But more broadly, and for Democrats, are there other associations? And I think the key message here is that it's not quite automatic, right? So Republicans tried certain types of associations that don't seem to have worked back then. So it needs to be something, or at least that's one interpretation that I think is plausible. It needs to be something that kind of resonates with voters in a way that makes sense in their minds, right? So this idea that this is a disease that's coming from abroad, therefore the association with immigration kind of makes sense. You would have to think about whether there are other associations that, quote unquote, make sense in the same way, right? So I think the things to look at are these possible associations that may or may not be present, and whether politicians are going to try to latch on to other things. So I think in general it's quite overwhelmingly likely, I think, that there's going to be some impact, and not just because of sort of the huge economic and policy shock that COVID represents, but because of these psychological associations as well. So I'm just going to stop here and looking forward to the questions.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Felipe. Let's go over to Stuti. You're up, Stuti. And Stuti, you're unmuted. Great.
Yes. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone's staying safe and well. My presentation is on examining the relationship between governance and the success of policies to manage the pandemic. Given the unprecedented nature of this global shock, we are learning in real time. So in my talk, I'll offer arguments for how we can use available governance and political economy research to interpret real-time events as they unfold, and then try to offer ideas for what policymakers can do now and going forward from a governance perspective. First, let's step back a bit and refresh our minds about the thinking on the relationship between governance and success of economic policies in general before the coronavirus. So before 1996, international organizations focused on large infrastructure investments that would help economies to take off. And in that sense, governance was behind the curtain, not talked about. But after the Cancer of Corruption speech in 1996, a focus on governance began to happen in international development policy, largely through capacity building type projects, with the aim of sort of drawing lessons from best practices of government agencies in developed countries, and including from countries like Singapore and institution of Singapore-style anti-corruption agencies. And this is very much was work in progress, and we are learning over the years about whether this kind of transplanting best practice approaches from other countries works or not. And what I think it would be fair to say that a broad conclusion is that this remains one of the most difficult and least understood problems of our times: how to establish wise and restrained public institutions. And the way an economist might interpret the meaning of wise and restrained is a role for the state that is simultaneously strong to protect property rights and establish law and order, but which also is circumscribed, relying on markets for economic prosperity and market-led growth as the most powerful engine to reduce poverty. Yet, even in the most laissez-faire economics tradition, there is a need for institutions going beyond protection of property rights and legal institutions. And this is the need for institutions to address market failures. So before coronavirus, we were talking about the existential threat of climate. So markets have failed to price carbon. There's need for institutions in the very basic textbook economics model for concerns with the ethics of distribution and inequality. And there is, again, classic textbook economics model. There's a role for institution to address public goods problem, and the disease control and managing disease outbreak is, of course, the nature of the public good problem we are dealing with today. And part of the reason why addressing these, understanding how to get these wise and restrained public institutions has remained such a challenge is because power and politics is at the heart of the problem, and many international organizations really fear talking about this openly. We are beginning to get better at this. And so, for example, the World Development Report of 2017 on governance laid bare the fact that power and politics is at the center of the problem. So what is different about the coronavirus times that we live in? So one is there's sweeping public health regulations that have been adopted by governments. Sorry, I'm just trying to move I cannot see my own slides. Okay, yes. So one is that the governments have adopted sweeping public health regulations. The other is that governments have been thrust into commanding heights and wartime mode of command and control, and this raises some new questions and concerns from a governance perspective. Will people comply with public health regulations? In the popular press, this has been labeled as an issue of trust. Will there be riots on the streets or social chaos? Again, the popular press has been labeling this as arising from distrust. Will governance challenges get worse? Will there be power grabs? You know, the image of a leviathan raising its head. Will there be erosion of markets as forces of growth? Will the left-wing governments take control? Will politics of fear lead to further erosion of markets or worse, human rights violations? And what should international agencies do to manage or forestall these concerns? So let me begin with the first concern that immediately happened as public health regulations began to be adopted, which is, will people comply with public health regulations? What are we learning from real-time events as this unfolds? The example from the United States is of confusing signals from political leaders and distrust of experts. And this is in fact consistent with established research from before the crisis on how ideological polarization can lead people to resist scientific evidence that runs contrary to their prior beliefs. Dan Kahan and others at the Yale Center for Cultural Cognition have been examining this in lab experiments with American subjects, and they've sort of built a body of evidence on this, on how people are really resistant to science when it runs against their ideological beliefs. And then on the other hand, we have the example from India, where there were clear signals from political leaders across all political parties of the need for sweeping public health regulations and lockdown in particular. And the reading of real-time events through the popular press is people by and large in India want to comply with the new rules, but too many are simply physically unable to. So we have the case of the migrant workers who have no homes or space to socially distance themselves. So I'm now going to switch to focusing on the case of India's migrant workers. This is an image of them leaving the capital Delhi, where they had moved from the poorest states of India, one of them being Bihar. And now they are, after the lockdown, they were forced to move back. And this is what greeted them when they reached home. Their own villages and families locked down the village, refusing entry to the migrants returning home. This Hindi sign here literally says lock down in Hindi. And you can see the young people of the village trying to enforce the lockdown. So interpreting these two contrasting examples, on the one hand, the richest and most advanced institutional market economy in the world, facing real political disagreement and confusion and resistance to the lockdown. And on the other, India, where all these images, despite the physical constraints to locking down for some people who have no space to socially distance, there is every effort to lock down. So how can we think about, interpret this using available research on legitimacy and trust? So the first argument I'm going to make is it's useful to interpret this by distinguishing between legitimacy and trust. While both are about beliefs or expectations about how others are likely to behave and involve the use of informal pressure or social sanctions, there is an important difference the argument is going to matter in real time as events unfold. So the view of legitimacy that I would argue in favor of comes from a recent paper by Robert Akerlof, where he models legitimacy in an economic principal agent model, and in which legitimacy is defined as a rule-specific attribute. So in this model, a principal with authority finds it easier to enforce an order if the order is regarded as legitimate by the agents on whom the principal is enforcing it. And regarding what it means for agents to regard a rule as legitimate is if they believe that others are following it. So the compliance with the rule is essentially enforced through peer-to-peer monitoring and the risk of or the costs of incurring social sanctions should anyone deviate from the order. Now, this modeling of legitimacy in Akerlof's model can be linked to similar arguments that were made separately by Kaushik Basu in his analysis of what explains why some countries have laws on paper that are not effectively implemented. And how do we get compliance with a new law? And Kaushik used the idea of focal point in game theory to argue that a new law works and only works if it changes the focal point in the game being played out in society. That is, if it changes beliefs about whether others are going to comply. This perspective can lead us to set out certain hypotheses about legitimacy, which are different from other conceptions of legitimacy, such as in the World Development Report 2011 on conflict, in which legitimacy was bundled with government performance and service delivery and acquired by building trust through effective service delivery. So legitimacy and trust were conflated with service delivery. It's also very different from other views that say legitimacy is about democratic processes, and only when decisions are democratically taken do they have legitimacy. So let me just quickly go through these novel hypotheses based on a focal point view, which may apply to real times of this unprecedented pandemic going forward. One, legitimacy of post-shock new rules is not necessarily lower in developing countries, despite pre-shock lower trust, as measured by high perceptions of corruption, for example. Two, low levels of pre-shock trust in government can coexist with a high level of initial legitimacy because of the nature of a global public bad shock, because of its global scale and immediate life's risk, which can create a focal point. Legitimacy of new rules, I'm going to keep putting this in parentheses because it should not be confused with legitimacy of institutions, democratic institutions in general, is lower in countries with greater ideological polarization in political institutions. Legitimacy is lower where government bureaucracies are weaker, by which we mean have lower autonomy to pursue a defined technical mandate. And once political polarization and bureaucracy strength are controlled for, there is, the hypothesis is that there should be insignificant difference in legitimacy between democratic and authoritarian institutional regimes. So
Stuti, let me just jump in to give you your 5-minute warning, please. Thank you.
Oh gosh, okay. So the implications of, so essentially what I've described here with a focal point view is a windfall of legitimacy to many countries going forward, which can have two very different types of effects. Political leaders can use this for the politics of divisiveness and fear, as Felipe was just describing. People in developing countries, political leaders with left-wing characteristics can use it for power grabs, but it is also an opportunity for reform leaders to strengthen public institutions in this wise and restrained ways. And what I was going to talk about in the rest of my talk was how can international organizations exercise a comparative advantage they have of being outside the domestic political game to strengthen the hands of reform leaders, not by picking donor darlings and reform champions, but in apolitical and non-partisan ways. Let me just quickly try to show you what is the risk, what is the governance challenge facing the policy response that experts are advising, which is increased direct cash transfers, war scale management of supply chains, testing, and increasing public spending on health and delivering it through frontline health workers who can be trusted. This was the key lesson from the Ebola outbreak. So what do we know about trust? Now, trust in this case looks very different from a large literature on generalized trust, which is not that helpful. So we did a survey in Bihar, the state from which it's a very large survey of very different levels of respondents. And let me just quickly share with you some of the examples of distrust coming out of this survey. We asked people, health workers, from the bottom up to the supervisor level about the extent to which they agree with the following statement: irrespective of my efforts, the system will not allow people's health outcomes to improve. So the top bar is for supervisors who are at the highest level in the health cadre, and the bottom bar is for CHW, is community health workers. These are very humble, low-level, village-level health workers. Across the cadres, there's the modal, by far the modal response is people agree with this statement, that irrespective of their efforts, the system they do not trust will allow people's health outcomes to improve. Another question was, in my work, I have to take permission for every little thing, which is a reflection of whether they are trusted to do their work. Again, across the cadres, modal number of people agree that they have to take permission for every little thing, including supervisors. People are describing regular management meetings they have as being about discussing bad performance and involving scoldings. Supervisors show a similar picture. The blue line is whether supervisors say they discussed bad performance in meetings, and 76% say they always discuss bad performance. The frontline health workers are not getting their salaries paid on time because these are the least trusted cadre of workers in the public system in India. So the circle is around again these frontline community health workers who, at the time of our survey, had not received their salaries for 6 months or more, and these are precisely the providers battling the coronavirus at the front lines, who we are supposed to be clapping for. This is completely contrary to the logic of economic theory, which actually suggests that there should be a reduced reliance on scoldings and high-powered incentives, and greater role for recruiting intrinsically motivated agents, and for reducing top-down hierarchical monitoring, and greater role for autonomy and peer-to-peer professional norms. This economic theory has been recently augmented with insights from game theory. And what this suggests is there's a very complementary role for communication, as in any game theoretic multiple equilibria setting, of selecting between equilibria through communication to shift norms and beliefs. And we have a very interesting case of SAIS from several decades ago, but which remains relevant today, and which has not been explored because SAIS took on politics centrally, while external partners have focused on social accountability interventions, bypassing the state, focusing on NGOs and communities. And in fact, what all the evidence is showing us, and what people in developing countries are showing, is they are more active as political rather than social principles. And there is a real need to address knowledge gaps about how to treat contestability in local political markets. So the immediate implications are actually quite simple.
Hi, Stuti, we're at 20 minutes, so if you can sort of do your wrap up, please, that'd be great.
These are my last slides. Thanks for your patience. As we provide more resources to countries and people with great needs for basic life goods, let's change the situation from the one that is currently existing in a place like India of not paying wages to frontline health workers and treating them as quasi-volunteers, pay steady living wages, along with messaging and communication using the game theoretic insights in management meetings to move away from scoldings to signal trust and encourage peer-to-peer monitoring and professional norms. Use locally relevant media, SAIS style, to broadcast messages about the role of local political leaders in supporting, not hindering, the frontline health workers. This is where apolitical international agencies who are not part of the domestic political game have a particular comparative advantage. I refer everyone to the policy research report of the Development Research Group, Chapter 7, Box 7.3, about what this means for agencies like the World Bank, which have a political prohibition in our Articles of Agreement. And failure to address politics now in apolitical ways, and again, this report discusses how that can be done, in fact, will increase the risk of the politics of fear that Filipe talked about, and perhaps even power grabs by the Leviathans. Projects and policies can immediately use this detailed context-specific research that we've done in Bihar, where we've examined what these local media markets look like. We should not take communication lightly. And finally, I'll just end with this. We need more analytical rigor and clarity and fewer euphemisms to understand the potential of contestability in local political markets. And internal dialogue is already ongoing. I think we can talk much more clearly and rigorously about it using this moment of windfall legitimacy. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Stuti. Let's go over to Antonio for some comments.
Okay, thank you, Art. Just a second. I'm trying to share my screen with everybody, and just a second, okay. Okay, would you see my screen?
Yes, we can see them, Antonio. If you can just go to slide view, it'll be larger.
Okay.
Perfect. It's great.
Okay. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to comment on these two papers by Stuti and by Felipe and co-authors. I think both papers are really, really interesting. The challenge I have is that these papers, even though very, very interesting, are basically orthogonal at the beginning, in the sense that one talks about legitimacy and trust in a general theoretical framework and gives the case of Bihar. The second talks about fear, the role of fear in the election in 2014 congressional election in the US. So apparently these two papers are very different geographically and as a framework. However, I think they are a deep thing in common, and I will elaborate on this. And I think the deep thing in common is the crisis as testing time for legacy. For legitimacy, apologies. This is a very old question. So I will use an example from classical literature to illustrate both papers and to see how they are connected, we can learn from the past. I put here hourglass so I can check. First, the most interesting example is actually coming from the Greek literature. It's a history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. There, Thucydides describes the political economy, the political effect of the war and the plague in Athens and what happened. And I think the lessons are really very interesting for today's analysis. Just to remind you, in 4030 BC, an epidemic broke out and devastated Athens. Citizens were very upset with the leader at the time, Pericles, because it was during a difficult war situation. It was a very dramatic situation. So Pericles gave a very important speech, which is very emotional, which became famous. I think it's one of the most famous speeches in history. And it's a funeral oration, it's called here in the US. And he managed to tame the people's resentment and to ride out the storm at the beginning. However, there was some internal uproar and they managed to kick him out for a while, but afterwards he came back and he was re-elected and he became the strategos again and led, and unfortunately after a few months he died, but this is another story. So just to be sure that we picture the situation, I put also this picture. You see Pericles on the left and he giving the funeral oration on the left, on the right. What are the lessons which are key for today? First, there is a crisis, the epidemic. Second, there was an emotional final speech, which is very important for legitimacy, and I will argue and I will see how this is connected with what Stuti and Felipe were arguing. At a very short term, there is a popular uproar. Finally, he is in the medium term, we'll see modern terminology, he is elected again to become strategos and leads with confidence the nation. I summarize the argument in these graphs. You have the crisis on top. You have some pre-existing legitimacy, and you have some manipulation, could be good and could be bad. You could have, in the short run, some political unrest. You have two outcomes out of it. Or you enhance legitimacy, and this is what basically Stuti was arguing, or you have a regime change, and I will talk about this. If you enhance legitimacy in the short term, you enhance legitimacy for the next crisis, and this reinforces your power. And this is what windfall legitimacy, the terminology that Stuti had introduced. So I like this scheme because it allows us to put all the two papers and some research we are doing at the IMF in a context. Let me explain the context. Well, at the top left here, some manipulation. This is the paper by Filipe and co-authors. They are basically trying how political manipulation can affect pre-existing legitimacy. Possible unrest, this is in the middle. This is something that we are doing here at the fund, and I will give you some flavor of the research in progress. And third here, what Stuti was talking about, which is how legitimacy trust is enhanced possibly by the experience of going through a crisis. I will talk also slightly, 1 minute, about the regime change. So this scheme allows us to analyze, to put all the three papers in context, and to see how they are connected, and to have a mini theory of crisis and political consequences. First, let me talk with the left top corner, manipulation. As Felipe was saying econometrically, this could be a very important role. I go back and I take a little tour in pragmatic and linguistics, which have studied how the manipulation of language can really affect our beliefs. And here the reference is Herberg and his theory of implicature. His theory is that basically Herberg was a philosopher. He wrote about 50 years ago, I think. And his theory was that when we do speak, we do imply a lot of things. And sometimes what we do imply is much more important of what we say is implicitly. So when I say I slept on a boat yesterday, the implication is that this was not my boat. I don't say this, but everybody believes this. When I say Antonio is Italian, but is nice, the implication, even though I don't say, is that the Italians are not nice. This soap is not good only for your skin, but also something else. The implication that you derive is that you focus on the good for your skin and you take for granted. There are a lot of neuropsychological basis for this theory right now. Basically, we use the information given as implied, we take for granted, and we are less prone to question it. So this is a technique which is widely used by the advertisement industry and by the political messaging. So, and actually, Felipe gave a very good example. And when Senator Rand Paul said a wide open policy is not only a danger for national security purpose, but also this means that we tend to process the information danger for national security as a given, so not to question it. There are plenty of studies, and I think that a possible extension of the paper is to look how implicature is used in the messaging of these various things. And this is something that ad industry uses quite a lot.
Antonio, I'll just give you 3 or 4 minutes to wrap up.
Okay,
thank you.
I wrap up. Well, I take issue for one statement by Stuti and by other. Do epidemics cause civil unrest? This is part of the popular wisdom. It's a common, it seems logical, but the economic, the evidence is not clear base. We have done, some colleagues of mine are doing some study using a novel database on reported social unrest index, measuring social unrest as reported by a news outlet, and correlate this with a database on unrest. And they couldn't find a good result. Now, as always, in negative studies, we have to look more carefully, because but we couldn't find they couldn't find much much effect of social unrest on civil unrest, at least immediate. We do have some anecdotes, for instance, Ebola in Liberia in 2014, but it's not a given that there is this strong correlation, even despite the popular wisdom, so to speak. There is also another issue. How do we disentangle epidemics from correlated third factors, quality of public service or other things? And this brings me to the last point. Even though epidemics may not have a big effect in the very short term in terms of civil unrest, they have a deep political implication if they are able to show how inefficient and corrupt is a government. Here there are two examples. One is 86 tragedy in Chernobyl, which is considered a key factor in showing how inefficient and bad was the Soviet system in dealing with a major emergency. The second was a Mexico City earthquake in '85, which showed how the corruption of the PRI party had led to many mispreparation, so to speak, and widespread violation of the code. So just to sum up, what we have learned, legitimacy is key during crisis, especially in this crisis where you do not have enough people. You cannot enforce your orders. You have to rely by force. You have to rely on people good sentiment and people sense of responsibility. And this is only if you have legitimacy ex ante. Trust legitimacy can be boosted during crisis. The funeral oration by Pericles, but there is also in negative. You have the example by Felipe where the shock caused this. Third, there is no evidence, at least as far as we know, that there is epidemics cause immediate unrest, as Thucydides was claiming and as Stuti also was mentioning. But there are good evidence that how bad and good a crisis manager has long-term deep political implications. These are much more difficult to measure econometrically. There is a positive cycle, which is called legitimate windfall. That is the positive side that Stuti focus on. There is also a negative possible cycle, which is a delegitimization of the current regimes. And I gave just two examples, but you could find also other examples. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonio. I will just ask you to unshare your screen so that we can subsequently see other speakers when they come on.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Stuti and Filipe, for the excellent presentations. We can now go over to our online audience for comments and questions for the speakers. What I'd like to do is actually just take a big batch of questions and reactions all at once, and then we'll just go back once to the three speakers to react to them. I think that'll be a little more time efficient. So if you're on WebEx, please use the raise your hand feature, and somehow magically I will see who has raised their hands and I'll try to get to you. While you're waiting to formulate your questions and find the raise your hand button, which is up beside your name in the top right of the screen, let me just sort of ask one question that I wanted to ask already from the middle of Filipe's presentation, and I think it's a little bit in what Antonio was talking about as well, and that is, at the end of Filipe's presentation, you basically asked sort of what are the other associations, what are the other effects, and I think that there is this sort of what some people have now referred to in the presentation as a rally around the flag effect or a solidarity effect. I think the rally around the flag effect has a more jingoistic interpretation, but simply, we're all in this together solidarity effect. They could actually have very, very positive effects on politics and outcomes. And the other thing that I'd really like to hear from both Stuti and Filipe on is, and particularly from Filipe, given that this shock is so different, is what we know about how governments are going to be judged by their competence of the response. And I think there is this very important possible cycle of sort of delegitimacy in contrast to the legitimacy windfall that Stuti talked about. So let me read out a couple of questions that we've gotten from our from YouTube audience. apologies because I'm going to have to try to sort of paraphrase them as I read them here. So there's kind of a battery of questions from Sharif Salah. So the first question for Felipe is, what do we know about these rally around the flag effects, and does it provide benefits to incumbents? Sharif also has a question for Stuti. On your point that legitimacy of new rules being weaker with weaker bureaucracy, does that mean that decentralized states will face far less trust than centralized states? And also a general question from Sharif. Considering that a global recession is likely, at least in the short term, how would this cancel out any long-term legitimacy gains that governments might get from their handling of the pandemic? So basically, they'll be rewarded for handling the pandemic well, but perhaps penalized by the economic shock. So that's from the YouTube audience just now. I'll turn over to Chalar. I see that you've raised your hand. Go ahead, Chalar.
Chalar, you're unmuted now. Jalar, can you hear us?
You cannot hear me?
I think I can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So my question was along the same lines about decentralization. I mean, one thing that's common with India and the US is the decentralized figure, and the response to the epidemic is actually happens, a lot of it at the more local level, at the governor's level, versus in the case of China, where they can immediately mobilize 40,000 doctors and nurses and send them to Wuhan. So how does that structure play in terms of chaos, and how does it help or hurt the local versus the federal politicians? Does that not matter at all, that the federal politician reaps the benefit and pays the price?
Thank you, Chalar. Ala, why don't you just go ahead and acknowledge anybody else with their hands up?
Nobody so far. I'll let you know.
Okay, well, if you prefer to do this the way we do it in real life seminars and just butt in with a question, the floor is open. Please just remember to unmute yourself and jump in.
Just a question or comment. I mean, people were writing in the chat, so I actually thought that you would take comments and questions from the chat. One thing I thought about during the first presentation is that a key difference with coronavirus disease relative to Ebola is that it was not first introduced in the US by a foreigner, but by a returning US citizen. And I'm thinking that that might have create some differences in terms of using the immigration angle, even in the fact that when the borders were closed from Wuhan in America, these restrictions exempted Americans who were returning from abroad. And the whole idea that, you know, if we are to accept globalization, then then travel and tourism is you know, an essential part of this. So, you know, it will be interesting to see how we deal with this after COVID-19. Thank you.
Thanks very much. This is Jehan, right? I saw you on the chat before.
Yes.
Yes, thanks. Anybody else want to jump in? Just introduce yourself as well before you speak, please. Okay, well, if we don't have further questions right now, I'll just ask Ali to mute everybody again because there's some typing in the background.
Yes, I'm checking. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. It's great to have that power. What I'll do is go maybe just in reverse order to the speakers. So I'll give Antonio a chance to reflect on some of the discussion, and then we'll go to Stuti and we'll reserve the final word for Filipe. So over to you, Antonio.
Thank you very much. First, to respond the issues that which were raised, let's not forget that this pandemic happened in a particular moment in the political economy history, is when populist sentiment was rising all over the world. Populist means that you don't trust or you criticize the people in power. You don't believe in the power of the experts, and you don't believe in the power of coordination. And this makes the politics of pandemics much more difficult because the authorities that should be overseeing the response, the expert and the international and national coordination are not there, are under attack already before the crisis. The second, and this comes to answer the issue about decentralization. We see something very interesting happening in many decentralized states or relatively decentralized. There is a reluctance by the central or the local authorities to take a position in the difficult trade-off. There is a very difficult trade-off between health and economics, and both are very costly, and if you are successful in stopping the epidemics, people will attack you because the economy will suffer a lot. If you are not successful, they will attack you anyway. So it's such a difficult trade-off. What we do observe is that politicians basically give up the ability, their role of choosing. Look at the President Trump here, but also in other countries. I'm familiar with Italy, for instance. Basically, central authorities are a little bit reluctant to take the toughest decision, while the regional authorities, local, subnational authorities are taking this. It's almost as, despite all the rhetorics, the central authority is very afraid to step up and to take a leadership role. And I think that this may have in the longer term, in the short term is okay, save them from criticism. In the longer term, may have some consequence on legitimacy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Antonio. Over to you, Stuti.
Thank you. First, thanks very much, Antonio, for your very useful comments and the fact that you had to deal with not 2 but 3 papers. You received 2 from me. And thank you to everyone for the comments and questions. To address the main comment Antonio had was taking issue with whether pandemics increase civil unrest. I'm happy to concede the point that perhaps pandemics don't have, in a statistical sense, a significant increase, lead to a significant increase in social unrest. But I think from a policy perspective, that issue is not perhaps that interesting or helpful because we were already living in a world with increasing civil unrest, with growing protests on the streets across countries. And so the question is, how do we think about the changed political setting to respond to these to this unrest? On the second point that Art asked about the solidarity effect, yes, indeed, that is the argument I was making, that one type of association with this pandemic. So to answer also Felipe's last point about are there other associations, a very intuitive and obvious other association, which is in the phrase "we are all in this together," is that health is this is a contagious health problem. So when flies don't know difference between identities, viruses don't distinguish between people of different religions or ideological identity. So this moment of strengthening public health systems as a classic public good or with negative externalities could in fact be a moment to develop those wise and restrained public institutions. On decentralization, I think my response generally is I don't think it's a trade-off with strong bureaucracies. You can have strong bureaucracies within decentralized governments. And in fact, what we are seeing and what we documented in the policy research report on politics is that local political contestation has grown around the world and across sort of countries with very different types of national political regimes. And these forces of local political contestability, which we've documented in the report in this recent paper on Bihar, in fact suggest ways in which communication can be taken more seriously, perhaps highlight this solidarity role of we are all in it together to combat a public health crisis, and that is the argument that was being made. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuti. Back to you, Felipe.
Thanks a lot. A lot of great thoughts here. Thank you first to Antonio. I think the best discussions are those that really draw these connections that were not obvious to begin with. So I think that was a great discussion. And just to respond to some of the points that Antonio made, just some thoughts that occurred to me. The issue about the messaging and Implicature, I think it's great. And actually, what I see as the next step in this particular agenda for us is to sort of investigate the role of the media as well in kind of transmitting the message. I mean, we point out how the media made a big deal out of this just before the election, and then it basically kind of collapses right upon the election in terms of the media exposure around it. So I think that's one of the key things that we want to understand. And when you think about our results in terms of the manipulation that Antonio mentioned, I think one of the key insights that I would draw here is that it also shows sort of the limits of manipulation in the sense that not all of the strategies really worked, right? So they were really heavy on the Obama angle, and it didn't seem to have worked so much, which I think gets back to the point of sort of the other associations that I kind of left hanging at the end, and Stuti kind of came just right now, I think, very much with this and Art as well, and when he was talking about sort of this angle of solidarity and of health, right, and sort of healthcare as one possible association, and the anxiety surrounding healthcare, particularly I think in the U.S. but in other places as well. I think these are the kinds of associations that I think we may see resonating as well. So I think that's really important. I think in terms of the question about sort of the policy judgment and what we know about what how voters might approach this, I think one thing that is clear from the evidence. So there's this paper by Neil Malhotra, and I forget the co-authors, but about how voters don't seem to reward preparedness for disaster, right? So whether you have prepared well for the disaster or not doesn't seem to be rewarded. So I think that's something that is important. So the fact that we were exposed to, because people have a hard time making the counterfactuals, right? What would have happened is something that people have a hard time making out, which I think gets to the point about the health versus economy trade-off, which I would frame slightly differently from what Antonio did. I don't think there is right now that much of a trade-off in the sense that what's really dragging the economy down is not so much the measures, the lockdown measures, but the virus, right? And the fear of the virus. So, one thing that I was reading that I think illustrates this is domestic travel is still, quote unquote, open, but is down 97% because people are choosing not to fly, right? People are choosing not to go to restaurants. This is way down before the lockdowns came into place. But what I think the trade-off is before the crisis becomes evident, and that's where the government failure and it's kind of easy to understand the political economy of it, right? So if you had intervened and locked things down before the crisis emerged, that would have had a much stronger impact because it would have contained the crisis earlier. But you can't really do that because the backlash will be tremendous, right? People's like, are you doing all of this because a handful of cases? So that's where the failure is. And I think Antonio is very right. And sort of that's where the trade-off is really, really strong, right? At that point. And that's what happened in Italy. And that's kind of a failure of governance that I think is very hard to address. Another point about the rally around the flag and sort of what we know about that. I think we know that it exists, in the U.S. I think it's quite clear in response to wars and external crisis, But I think it's very short-lived, right? I think people forget, but like Jimmy Carter had this major boost in his approval ratings when the Iran hostage crisis happened in 1979, because, you know, like there's this crisis, a foreign enemy rally around, but that is quite short-lived, right? So I think that's one thing that we know about that I think is important. And just one final point about the issue of sort of the difference between Ebola and COVID in terms that now it's not so much being brought by immigrants, but, you know, it was returning U.S. citizens, so on and so forth. I think that's true. And that's why what explains that the association being drawn now is not so much about immigrants, but about China, right? And so it's still kind of like this outside agent, but it has to be different so that it resonates, right? I think that actually illustrates the point that you have to do it in a way that quote unquote makes sense for voters, right? Or for the audience. And I think this illustrates the point. So you can't say like, well, you know, have to close the border with Mexico, even though like there has been some talk about that, but it has, you know, that's not really what this crisis is about, right? It's like if fear is being triggered by shark attacks, right? You're not going to blame that on foreigners, or it's not that obvious, right? So it really underscores the point that the message needs to find associations that resonate. But I'm just going to stop here because I guess I've talked too much already. But yeah, very like great food for thought in all of this.
Well, thank you very much, Felipe. No, not talking too much at all. I very much appreciate from all three of you, Felipe, Antonio, and Stuti, for your presentations and discussion. And, you know, a little, the odd classical reference is something that you don't normally expect from our friends across the street at the IMF. So, Antonio, very glad to see you being not typecast. So again, a big thank you to everyone. I think my one reflection on this is that just when we're you know, when you start looking at the epidemiology of COVID, you rapidly realize that whatever you knew yesterday probably doesn't apply today because things are changing so quickly. And, you know, the same is true for the economic shock and policy response. And I'm thinking now even more so with the, you know, what kind of political dynamics this will unleash and how it's going to matter for the future is probably in the same vein, that every day we're going to be learning something new. So it's wonderful to get up-to-date insights from all of you. Thank you very much. And I'll just put in a plug that this is an ongoing series of e-seminars, and we have more coming up next week and the week after. They're all listed in the invitations that you get. So hope to see you at the next and subsequent ones. Thank you very much, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.